Darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a closed room or a drawn curtain. The other kind. The absolute kind. The kind that presses against your eyes and makes you wonder if your eyes are even open. The kind that has weight. Then, a flash. For 1/10 of a second, the world exists. Wet, black rock. A tangle of roots. Something pale and unidentifiable in the lower left corner of the frame. Then the darkness collapses back in, heavier than before, as if the light had only made it angrier. Another flash. A tree trunk. Close. Too close. The bark slick with water. Beyond it, nothing. Beyond it, just the jungle swallowing everything. Insects screaming somewhere above. The sound of water, not rain falling, something deeper, something moving fast, somewhere unseen, somewhere wrong. Another flash. Wet hair. In complete darkness, illuminated for a fraction of a second, there is wet hair. Nothing else. No face. No context. Just hair pressed against something dark, something wet, the image so brief and so strange that for a moment your brain refuses to process it. Then nothing. The camera is still clicking. Somewhere in the darkness of the Panamanian jungle, someone is still pressing the shutter button. 43 more times. 57 more times. 90 times in the dark, the camera fires into absolute blackness and records images of nothing. Or images of things that mean nothing. Or images of things that mean everything, if only anyone knew how to read them. By the time anyone saw these photographs, by the time these images were pulled from a memory card found inside a backpack discovered on a remote mountain trail in western Panama, the girls who took them were already gone. Their names were Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. They were 21 and 22 years old. They were from the Netherlands. They were best friends. And in April of 2014, they went for a hike. They never came back. This is not a story about what happened to them. No one knows what happened to them. This is a story about what they left behind. The photographs, the phone records, the fragments of evidence scattered across one of the most biodiverse and impassable wilderness areas in Central America. This is a story about what the evidence says, and what it refuses to say, and the terrible space between those two things where the truth is still hiding. Kris Kremers had dark hair and a wide smile that seemed to take up slightly more space than her face had room for. She studied social work. She was methodical, organized, thoughtful, the kind of person who made lists and followed through. Lisanne Froon was blonde, athletic, photogenic in the casual way of someone who doesn't think about it. She was studying applied sciences. She ran. She climbed. She was the kind of person who looked at a mountain and felt pulled toward it. They had been friends for years by the time they booked their trip to Panama. Close in the way that only certain friendships become close. The kind where the silences are comfortable and the inside jokes require no explanation, and the decision to travel together to a foreign country feels less like a leap and more like a natural extension of something already in motion. They arrived in Boquete in early April 2014. Boquete is a small mountain town in the Chiriquí province of western Panama, and it is, by most measures, genuinely beautiful. Coffee farms climbing the hillsides. Narrow roads winding through cloud forest. The kind of place where the air tastes different, cleaner, cooler, carrying the faint sweetness of altitude and rain. Backpackers come here. Birders come here. People looking for something quiet and authentic and slightly off the beaten path come here, and they usually find it, and they usually leave feeling richer for the experience. Kris and Lisanne were supposed to be in Boquete for a specific purpose. They had arranged to volunteer with a local organization that helped teach English to children in the area. It was the kind of trip that feels purposeful and meaningful and slightly adventurous, giving something back while also seeing the world. They had arrived with that energy, that particular brightness that comes from being young and capable and somewhere new and doing something that feels worthwhile. The volunteering was scheduled to begin the following week. In the meantime, They had days to explore. The photographs from these early days are warm. Warm in temperature and warm in feeling. Lisanne and Kris at a local restaurant. Kris holding something at a market. The two of them at a coffee farm, squinting into sunlight that turns everything golden. These are the photographs of people who are happy, who are present, who have no idea that anything is wrong because nothing is wrong yet. Nothing is wrong for a few more days. April 1st, 2014. A Tuesday. The last full day either of them was ever seen by anyone who could later account for it. They decided to hike the Pianista Trail. The Pianista is a well-known route that begins near the edge of Bouquet and climbs through cloud forest toward a ridge with panoramic views. It is popular with tourists. It is not considered dangerous for its first several kilometers. There are signs. There are other hikers. There is a recognized turning point, a summit area where most people stop, take photographs, turn around, and descend back to town in time for dinner. Most people stop there. Kris and Lisanne left their hostel that morning and began the trail. They were seen by a local guide named Feliciano Gonzalez, who encountered them on the path. He pointed them toward the trail. He directed them toward the summit. He told them, and this detail matters, that they should not continue beyond the summit. The trail beyond the ridge dropped into the Ngabe Bugle indigenous territory, into wilderness that was remote and difficult and not intended for casual hikers. They nodded. They smiled. They continued up the trail. At some point during that afternoon, they crossed the summit. They kept walking. We know this because of the photographs. The camera they carried documented the day in reasonable detail, and what it shows is a progression, from the sunlit lower trail to the cloudier, denser upper forest to the summit with its views of the valley below, and then, past the summit, into territory that looks different. Darker. More tangled. The path less defined. The images taken after the summit have a quality that is difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore in retrospect. The light changes. The trees close in. The views disappear. The last photograph taken in daylight was time-stamped at 1 p.m. After that, the camera stayed dark for 11 hours. Let that number sit for a moment. 11 hours. From 1 in the afternoon to just past midnight. No photographs. And in those 11 hours, the world Kris and Lisanne had walked into, the jungle past the summit, the territory they had been told not to enter, swallowed them completely. What investigators found next made even less sense. Their phones were still working. This is one of the most important and most maddening facts in this entire case. In the hours after they crossed the summit and disappeared from the photographic record, Kris and Lisanne made repeated attempts to contact emergency services. The phone records are documented and they paint a picture of escalating desperation. At 4:39 p.m., more than 3 hours after the last daylight photograph, there was an attempt to call 112, the European emergency number. It did not connect. At 5 p.m., another attempt. At 6 p.m., another. Over the following hours, there were calls to local emergency numbers, calls to the guides they had met, calls that never connected or went unanswered or failed in the patchy coverage of the mountain wilderness. The last call attempt logged on either phone came just before midnight. By then, it was raining. No one in Bouquet knew anything was wrong yet. The calls had not connected. The hostel had no reason to worry. It was still the first day. People hike. People sometimes hike longer than they intended. People are sometimes late returning. The next morning, when Kris and Lisanne had not come back, their fellow hostel guests began to be concerned. The day after that, a formal search was initiated. Feliciano Gonzalez, the guide who had seen them on the trail, joined the search parties that moved up the Pianista and beyond the summit. The jungle gave nothing back. For 10 days, hundreds of people searched. Local volunteers, police, indigenous community members who knew the territory, tracking dogs, aerial surveys. The forest was combed in expanding circles from the last known point of contact. Nothing was found. No sign of the girls, no abandoned gear, no indication of where they had gone or what had happened to them. And then, on the 11th day, something was found. Not the girls. Something stranger, in its own way. A blue backpack. It was discovered near a creek by a local indigenous woman named Doris Jimenez, some distance from the main search area. Inside the backpack were items belonging to Kris and Lisanne, a water bottle, money, Lisanne's passport, sunglasses, a bra. And inside the backpack was the camera. The same camera that had gone silent at 1 p.m. on April 1st. Investigators pulled the memory card. They uploaded the images. And what they found on that card is the reason this case has never been forgotten, never been closed, never been fully explained. Not by investigators, not by forensic experts, not by the thousands of people across the internet who have spent years analyzing every pixel. This is where the case becomes truly disturbing. The daylight photographs were what you would expect. The trail. The trees. The summit views. The two girls smiling with the valley spread out behind them, the coffee farms visible in the distance, the green of the Chiriki lowlands stretching toward the horizon. There is one photograph, time-stamped at 1 p.m., in which Lisanne is looking at the camera, and there is something behind her eyes that some people interpret as unease and other people say is simply a squint against the brightness. Probably a squint. Probably nothing. But you look at it now and you feel something shift. The last daylight photograph. 1 p.m. Then nothing. 11 hours of nothing. And then midnight arrives, and the camera wakes up again. At 12:53 a.m. on the morning of April 2nd, 13 hours after their last emergency call attempt, 17 hours after they first crossed the summit, someone pointed the camera at the darkness and pressed the shutter. Flash. At 12:54 a.m., another photograph. At 12:56, another. The timestamps are close together at first, then irregular. Over the course of the next several hours, from just before 1 a.m. until almost 6 a.m., the camera fired into the darkness 90 times. 90 photographs taken in complete darkness over the course of 5 hours in the middle of a Panamanian jungle in the rain. The images show rock. They show vegetation, close and wet. They show darkness beyond darkness. They show, in one image, one specific image that forensic analysts have returned to again and again, wet hair. Just hair. The side of a head, or part of it, pressed against dark rock, the flash catching a few strands of blonde or dark or both, the rest of the frame claiming nothing. That image has no caption. It needs none. Investigators and online analysts have spent years studying these nighttime photographs. Some of what they found is concrete. The images suggest the girls were near a water source. The rock formations and the sound quality of the environment point toward a stream or river, possibly the Culebra River, which runs through the territory below the Pianista summit. The photographs of the surrounding terrain suggest they were in a confined space, a canyon, perhaps, or a deep ravine, somewhere the jungle walls rose steeply on all sides and the sound of rushing water was constant. Some of the photographs may be attempts at signaling. Several images appear to show arranged sticks or stones in formations that some analysts have called intentional, attempts to create visual markers or SOS signals from natural materials. There are photographs that seem to show plastic bags tied to branches, the kind of makeshift marker someone might create if they were trying to be visible, trying to be seen from above or from a distance. But here is the problem. Here is the thing that investigators kept returning to, the thing that made even experienced search and rescue professionals pause. The nighttime photographs are disorganized. They are chaotic. They are pointed in multiple directions, at multiple angles, at rock and water and darkness and nothing. They do not look like the deliberate, methodical documentation of someone calmly waiting for rescue. They look like something else. They look like panic trying to find the shape of purpose. And somehow, the photographs only raised more questions. There is a photograph called Photograph 509. This is not a number I am assigning for dramatic effect. The images from the memory card were analyzed in sequence, and analysts noted that the numbering had a gap. Image 508. And then image 510. Image 509 does not exist on the recovered card. Whether it was accidentally deleted, whether the camera malfunctioned, whether someone removed it deliberately, no one knows. What image 509 might have shown, what it might have recorded, what it might have explained, no one knows. The jungle kept the rest. Then there is the question of the time gap itself. The girls were on the trail at 1 p.m. They had phone signal, poor signal, but some signal, for at least the next several hours, given the call attempts that registered between approximately 4:30 p.m. and midnight. But the camera stayed dark from 1 p.m. all the way until after 12:30 a.m. That is more than 11 hours during which they were clearly alive, clearly attempting to communicate, clearly in distress, and yet the camera did not fire once. Why? This is the question that investigators asked. It is the question that online communities have debated for years. Were they too focused on finding their way out to bother documenting? Were they injured, and the camera inaccessible? Was the camera left somewhere while they moved, and only retrieved near midnight? Did something happen between 1 p.m. and midnight, something that changed their situation so dramatically that the world between those two timestamps is essentially unknowable? No one knows. And the not knowing is its own form of horror. Let me tell you about the theories. Not because any of them are confirmed. Not because any of them provide the closure that families and investigators and the thousands of people who have followed this case desperately want. But because understanding what could have happened, understanding the full spectrum of possibility, is the only honest way to sit inside this mystery. The most straightforward theory is the one that investigators have officially leaned toward, though they have never closed the case. Accidental misadventure. The girls crossed the summit, descended into unfamiliar territory, became disoriented in the dense forest, crossed the Culebra River or one of its tributaries, and became trapped, unable to retrace their path, possibly injured from a fall on the wet and treacherous terrain, certainly exhausted, certainly cold as the temperature dropped with nightfall. Boquete sits at high altitude. The nights in that region, even in April, drop to temperatures that can cause hypothermia in people who are wet, exhausted, and underdressed. The jungle at that elevation channels weather in unpredictable ways. A sunny afternoon becomes a cold, rain-soaked night very quickly, very completely. Under this theory, the nighttime photographs are the behavior of people in the early stages of a crisis, trying everything, trying to signal, trying to create markers, trying to survive a night that they believed would end in rescue at dawn. And perhaps dawn came, and perhaps they were found by the river, or perhaps they descended further trying to find civilization, and somewhere in that descent something went wrong. A fall. The river. Exposure. This theory is coherent. It accounts for most of the evidence. It gives a shape to the shapeless. But then there are the things it does not account for. If the girls were simply lost and injured from a fall, why did the backpack containing their valuables, their passport, their money, their camera, turn up weeks later in an area that search teams had already combed? The backpack's location was not obviously consistent with any obvious route from the last known position. It was found near water, yes, but near water in a way that felt, to some investigators, like it had been moved. There were also questions about witness statements. Feliciano Gonzalez, the guide who last saw the girls, gave statements that were later questioned for consistency. A Dutch couple who had also been on the trail that day had seen the girls, or believed they had, at a different point than originally reported. The witness accounts did not perfectly align, and the gaps between them opened space for questions about what had actually happened on that trail. There are those who have pointed to the possibility of a third party. Panama has, in the years before and after 2014, seen incidents involving tourists in remote areas that were connected to criminal activity. The Bocas del Toro region, not far from Boquete, had seen incidents. The question of whether Kris and Lisanne encountered someone else on that trail, someone whose intentions were not innocent, has never been definitively answered. It has been raised, examined, and left unresolved. There were scratches on some of the bones later recovered that some forensic analysts said were consistent with animal activity. Other analysts were less certain. And then there were the bones themselves. Approximately 8 weeks after the girls disappeared, in late May and into June 2014, human remains began to be found in the area below the Pianista summit. The remains were fragmentary bones. Some were found in or near rivers. Some were found scattered across a wider area. The recoveries happened over several weeks, piece by piece, fragment by fragment. The remains were identified through DNA as belonging to Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. But the way the remains were found, and their condition, and their distribution, created more questions than they answered. Some of the bones showed signs of what forensic anthropologists described as possible animal scavenging, consistent with what you would expect if remains had been left in the jungle for weeks and exposed to wildlife. The Colombian forensic scientist brought in to examine the bones noted some markings that she could not fully explain by animal activity alone. Dutch forensic experts, reviewing the evidence later, reached different conclusions on certain points than Panamanian investigators had. The Dutch and Panamanian analyses did not fully agree. This is the case in miniature: competing interpretations, incomplete data, and a gap at the center that refuses to close. The bones of the feet were found inside what remained of Lisanne's boots. The feet were largely intact within the footwear. This has been one of the most discussed and debated details in the case, because the preservation of the feet within the boots seemed, to some, inconsistent with what you would expect if the body had decomposed naturally in the jungle environment over the course of weeks. But forensic explanations exist. Boots can protect extremities from scavenging. The jungle is inconsistent. Decomposition is not linear or predictable in every environment. Still, the detail lingers. I want to talk about the photographs one more time. The nighttime photographs. Because I have been circling them, returning to them, teasing them, and now we need to sit inside them completely. Imagine being in that jungle. Not the jungle you have imagined from documentaries or travel photographs, the version that looks lush and beautiful and teeming with vivid life. Imagine the night version. Imagine the version that exists after the trail disappears under your feet, after the rain begins, after the last light of the afternoon drains out of the sky and leaves you standing in absolute darkness with the sound of fast water somewhere below you and insects shrieking from every direction and the wet cold pressing in from everywhere and no signal on your phone and no clear path back and no way to know how far you have gone or how far you would need to go to find your way out. You have a camera. You point it at the darkness and you press the button and for 1/100th of a second the world exists. Rock, root, water, bark. And then the darkness returns. You do it again. Maybe you are hoping someone will see the light. Maybe you are hoping to see something in the photographs that you could not see with your naked eye. Maybe you have moved beyond strategy and into something more desperate and more fundamental. You are pressing the button because pressing the button is something you can do, because action is its own form of survival, because stopping means only sitting in the dark and the rain and the cold and thinking about what is happening to you. 90 photographs. Someone pressed that button 90 times. And then the camera stopped. No one knows exactly what happened after the camera stopped. The phone records end near midnight. The photographs end somewhere before dawn. Whatever happened in that space, in the hours between the last camera flash and whatever morning brought, exists outside the record. It is a white room at the center of the mystery. No one has ever opened its door. There are online communities, and there have been for years, where people analyze these photographs with a dedication that is part forensic science, part obsession, part grief. They map the rock formations. They try to locate the exact position in the jungle based on the visible terrain. They argue about the plastic bags and whether they represent intentional signaling or coincidental image capture. They return, again and again, to photograph 509, to the missing image, to the gap in the sequence that might mean everything or might mean nothing. The case was officially listed as accidental by Panamanian authorities, though investigators acknowledged that not all questions had been resolved. The Dutch government had its own review conducted. Kris and Lisanne's families, in the years since, have continued to search for answers, to push for further investigation, to live in the terrible suspension of not knowing exactly what happened, not knowing what the last hours were like, not knowing whether there is something the evidence has not yet said. The families. Let's stay here for a moment. Lisanne Froon's parents. Kris Kremers' parents and siblings. People who received photographs and postcards and text messages from their daughters and sisters right up until those communications stopped, who went from reading about Panama coffee farms and volunteer teaching to sitting in rooms waiting for phone calls that would tell them something, anything, that would make the world make sense again. There is a specific kind of grief that attaches itself to unresolved cases. It is not the grief of loss alone. Loss, however devastating, has a shape, has a beginning and a middle and a terrible end. The grief of not knowing is something different. It is grief without edges. It is grief that cannot be placed because there is no firm ground on which to place it. You are always wondering. You are always turning over the last known details, looking for the thing you missed, the thing that would explain. You are always, in some part of yourself, still waiting. Kris's mother has spoken publicly about the years after her daughter's disappearance, about the investigations, about the photographs. She has described looking at the nighttime images and feeling her daughter's presence in them, feeling the panic, feeling the determination, feeling the love of someone who was still trying, who had not given up. That is what the photographs are, in their most essential form. Evidence of trying. Evidence of someone who pressed the button again and again in the dark because trying was all that was left. Let me tell you what we know. Not what we believe, or what we theorize, or what the internet has decided. What we know. We know that Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon were last seen on the Pianista Trail on the afternoon of April 1, 2014. We know that they crossed the summit and continued beyond it. We know that at 1 p.m., someone took the last daylight photograph. We know that between approximately 4:30 p.m. and midnight, 9 emergency calls were attempted from their phones. We know that just after midnight, 90 photographs were taken in complete darkness over the course of approximately 5 hours. We know that the backpack containing their belongings and camera was found weeks later in an area near a stream. We know that remains were recovered beginning in late May, identified through DNA as belonging to both women. We know that the photographs on that camera tell a story. We do not know how to read it. We know that photograph 509 is missing. We do not know what it showed. We know that the nighttime images were taken over hours, in darkness, in rain, in a jungle, by someone who was still alive and still pressing the button. We do not know what was in their mind as they pressed it. We do not know what they saw between flashes. We do not know what the darkness showed them that we cannot see. There is a temptation, when you spend time inside a case like this one, to arrive at certainty. To pick a theory and commit to it, to let it close the story and give it a shape you can live with. The internet does this. Forums do this. Documentary series do this. We arrive at a conclusion because the alternative, the honest alternative, the one that is actually true, is almost unbearable. The honest alternative is this. We do not know. Not we do not know yet. Not we do not know but will someday. Just we do not know. The jungle did not give up everything. The evidence that remains is incomplete and contradictory and interpreted differently by different experts. The gap at the center of this case is real and it has not been closed and it may never be closed. Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon went for a hike on a sunny Tuesday morning in April 2014. They were 21 and 22 years old. They had plans. They had friends. They had families who loved them and a volunteer program starting the following week and photographs on their phones of coffee farms and market stalls and each other laughing in the gold afternoon light of a country they had only just arrived in. They crossed a ridge. They did not come back. What came back, eventually, were fragments. The backpack. The camera. The bones found in the rivers and the forest. And the photographs. 90 flashes in the darkness of an April night in the Panamanian jungle, each one a fraction of a second of light in an immensity of dark, each one someone still alive, still trying, still pressing the button because that was what was left. We look at those photographs now and we feel something that does not have a name. It is not quite fear. It is not quite grief. It is the sensation of standing at the edge of something that goes down further than you can see. Of knowing that somewhere in the dark below you there is an answer, and also knowing, in some fundamental and unhappy way, that you will never reach it. The camera flashed 90 times. In the rain, in the dark, in the jungle that did not care. And then the camera stopped. And the jungle kept the rest. And somewhere in the darkness of the Cherokee Highlands, 2 young women whose names were Kris and Lisanne, who had laughed in photographs and made emergency calls and pressed a shutter button into absolute blackness because trying was all there was left to do, passed beyond the last piece of evidence they would ever leave behind. All they left were photographs. And photographs only show you what was there for the fraction of a second the shutter was open. Everything else, everything before and everything after and everything in the darkness between, belongs to the jungle. And the jungle does not give back what it keeps.